7 vials remaining. I lined them up on the cool, silent dwarven metal of the console, each a thin cylinder of glass filled with a shimmering, pale blue liquid. They were the last of the tonal filters, the culmination of 3 years of work that began in the libraries of the College of Winterhold and ended here, in the crushing, silent dark of Blackreach. 7. One for each day of the week if I were still tracking days. Down here, time was measured in the slow decay of fungi and the dwindling of supplies. For me, it was measured in these vials. They were all that stood between my mind and the cacophony that had driven Septimus Signus to his own particular brand of revelation. My name is Attius Valerius. I was once a respectable scholar of the college, specializing in pre-Natick history. I knew Septimus. Not well. I saw him as a brilliant but untethered mind, a cautionary tale whispered among the apprentices. He chased after the Elder Scrolls, the Heart of Lorcan, the Ogma, Infinium. He sought a singular grand answer to a question the Dwemer themselves had failed to survive. When he disappeared, consumed by the esoteric machinery he had unearthed in the ice north of the college, most wrote him off as another casualty of forbidden knowledge. I was not most. I studied his notes, the fragments he left behind, the ravings of a madman, Tolfdir had called them. But madness and genius are cut from the same cloth. Septimus was not wrong. He was simply looking in the wrong place. He thought the answer was in a book, a Daedric artifact gifted by Hermaeus Mora. He was a historian, so he looked for a text. But the Dwemer were not historians, they were architects of the impossible. Their final secret was not written, it was built, it was sung. It is still singing right here in the deep places of Skyrim. Blackreach is not a cavern, it is an instrument, a resonant cavity of continental scale. The Dwemer did not excavate it, they tuned it, every pillar, every crystalline formation, every silent staring automaton is part of the score. The problem is that the music is too vast for a mortal mind to comprehend. To listen to it unfiltered is to be unmade, your consciousness scattered into a million discordant echoes. This is what happened to the Dwemer. And this is where my work began. The tonal filters were my life's work, a complex alchemical solution of ground nirnroot, chorus egg proteins, and refined void salts, suspended in a saline solution enchanted with a very specific dampening ward. The nirnroot seeks the resonance. The chorus proteins provide a psychoactive medium to interpret it, and the void salts stabilize the whole volatile reaction. The ward is the most important part. It acts like a sieve, allowing the structure of the music through while blocking the overwhelming, soul-shattering amplitude. It allows one to listen. Septimus screamed into the abyss and heard only his own madness echoed back. I had learned to cup my ear and listen to its whispers. But the whispers were addictive and the filters were finite. 7 vials. The entire experiment, my entire life, now balanced on this small, fragile number. My hypothesis was simple, if insane. Septimus was right about the Dwemer achieving a form of transcendence, but he was wrong about the mechanism. It was not a book, it was a frequency. A single perfect chord that retuned their very existence, elevating them from the mundane reality of Nirn. I came here not to find them, but to hear the echo of their ascension, to chart the sound that unmade a race, and I had 7 chances left to get it right. I picked up the first vial, the liquid inside swirling like a captured nebula. The Dwemer console before me was a web of polished metal and softly glowing crystals. I had spent months reactivating it, bypassing ruined circuits and coaxing ancient machinery back to a semblance of life. It was a listening post, a spectrum analyzer for reality itself. But to read its output, I needed to be on the same wavelength. I uncorked the vial. The air, thick with the smell of damp stone and strange fungus, was momentarily cut by the sharp, sterile scent of the filter. I administered the dose, a quick, practiced injection into my forearm. The effect was not immediate. It began as a low hum behind my eyes, a pressure in my sinuses. Then the world began to sharpen. The faint, ambient glow of the giant mushrooms on the cavern ceiling was no longer just light. It was a visible frequency, a soft green note hanging in the air. The dripping of water from a stalactite was not a sound, but a percussive beat in a rhythm I could suddenly perceive, a rhythm that had been there all along. The silence of Blackreach was a lie. It was not silent. It was full of a sound so profound and all-encompassing that the human ear, in its crude limitations, simply registered it as absence. The filter was working. The cacophony resolved into a symphony. It was horrifying. It was beautiful. I could hear the slow, grinding tectonic plates miles below, the life force of the glowing flora, the lingering psychic residue of every creature that had ever lived and died in this abyss. And beneath it all, the foundation, the bass note of the world, the hum of the Dwemer machinery, not just in this room but throughout the entire cavern. A single, unified, resonant field. I turned back to the console. The crystals, once glowing with a steady, soft light, now pulsed with 1,000 complex rhythms. Lines of light, the Dwemer's own form of musical notation, danced across polished plates of ebony. My mind, shielded and guided by the filter, could follow it. I was not just hearing. I was understanding. The patterns were there. Faint, eroded by millennia, but there. The echoes of their great work. I adjusted a focusing lens, a large crystal suspended in a series of concentric brass rings. The patterns sharpened. I had found a new harmonic, a sub-frequency I had never detected before. It was a small thing, a footnote in the grand composition, but it was progress. It was proof. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, clumsy drum against the perfect rhythm of the deep. I worked for hours, my hand flying across my journal, sketching the notation, cross-referencing it with my previous findings. The filter held, my mind protected within its fragile bubble of sanity. Eventually, the pressure behind my eyes began to fade. The green light of the mushrooms became just light again. The dripping water was just a drip. The symphony dissolved back into a silence that now felt incomplete, a profound and unnerving emptiness. The filter was spent. I leaned back in the dwarven chair, my body slick with sweat, my muscles aching from a tension I had not even been aware of. My gaze fell upon the console where the vials were arranged. 6 vials. I moved the empty one to the side, a small glass corpse. The plan had just become tighter. The margin for error had shrunk. 6 chances left. I had to make them count. The elation of discovery was already being chased by the cold dread of scarcity. It was a familiar feeling in this sunless world. The second day, or what I designated as such, was spent analyzing the data I had gathered. I did not use a filter. I could not afford to. I had to make the effects of each dose last as long as possible, stretching the period of perception with long hours of mundane, unprotected analysis. The silence felt different now. Knowing what lay behind it made it heavier, more menacing. It was like living in a room with a sleeping dragon. I thought of Ilara. I often did in the quiet hours. She was a restoration mage at the college, practical, kind, with a healthy skepticism for the grand, esoteric theories that consumed people like me and Septimus. "You are chasing a ghost, Attius," she had told me, her hand on my arm, her touch a grounding force I had foolishly shrugged off. "Worse, you are chasing the ghost of a sound. What will you do if you find it? What good is a song that can only be heard by destroying yourself?" I had no answer for her then. only a lecture on tonal architecture and the Dwemer's mastery over the earth bones. She had listened patiently, but her eyes were full of a sadness I had not understood. I understood it now. She was not afraid I would fail. She was afraid I would succeed. My supplies were low. Not just the filters, but food, water. I had a small camp set up in the abandoned Dwemer Observatory, a defensible position overlooking a vast mushroom-lit cavern. But I had to hunt. The blind, savage Falmer that haunted these caves were a constant threat, but their degenerate cousins, the Chorus, were a source of meat and eggs. It was a risk, but a necessary one. I took my blade, a simple steel sword that felt hopelessly primitive in this city of impossible science, and ventured out from the safety of the observatory. The hunt was going well. I had located a Chorus nest in a narrow, waterlogged passage, the air thick with the creature's acrid stench. I had managed to kill a smaller hunter, its chitinous plates cracking under a desperate blow from my sword. I was harvesting the meat when I heard it. Not with my ears, but as a pressure change in the air, a sudden dampening of the cavern's ambient hum. A Falmer patrol. Their shuffling, skittering footsteps were designed for stealth in this environment, but their minds were loud with a devolved, predatory hunger. They were close. Too close. 3 of them, I thought. Maybe 4. They had me cornered in the passage. There was no time to think. My sword was a clumsy tool in the dark against their speed and numbers. I needed an advantage. I needed to see the way they saw, to hear the world as they did. My hand went to the pouch at my belt. I pulled out a vial, the second one. My mind screamed in protest. This was not the plan. This was a waste, a squandering of a precious resource on a common brawl. But survival is the prerequisite for discovery. I administered the dose, the needle finding my arm in the dark. The world exploded into sound and light. The Falmer were no longer just pale, twisted shapes. They were raging furnaces of raw, hateful noise. Their shrieks were not just sound. They were jagged red spikes of energy that tore at the air. I could perceive their movements before they made them, tracking the resonant disturbance their bodies created as they moved through the cavern's energy field. The world slowed down. A swinging bone club became a lazy arc of dissonant tones. A skittering advance was a crawling wave of chaotic frequencies. I moved between them, no longer a clumsy scholar, but a part of the symphony. My sword was an extension of my will, a conductor's baton bringing silence to the discord. I ducked under a swing I should not have seen, parried a thrust that came from my blind side, and drove my blade into the chest of a creature whose screech of rage I could feel as a physical blow against my mind. The filter protected me, but barely. It was like standing behind a glass window during a hurricane. When it was over, I stood panting in the sudden quiet, surrounded by the still warm bodies of the Falmer. The filter's effect was already beginning to wane, the world flattening back into its mundane shape. The cost hit me like a physical blow, a vial, an entire vial gone, for this. For a few pounds of Chorus meat and the right to live another day. I looked at the 5 remaining vials on the console back in my observatory. That was what this place did. It forced you to trade pieces of your soul, your future, your grand purpose, for another few hours of breath. I felt a surge of anger at the Falmer, at myself, at the entire cursed cavern. I had let myself be dragged down into a fight for survival, a distraction from the real work. 5 vials. The number was starting to feel small, frighteningly small. The incident with the Falmer had shaken me more than I cared to admit. The waste of a filter was a deep wound to my plan, a brutal reminder that the practicalities of survival could derail the most elegant of theories. I became more cautious, more paranoid. I spent the next cycle reinforcing the defenses around the observatory. setting crude traps made of Dwemer scrap and tripwires. The work was manual, tiring, and felt beneath me, but the thought of losing another vial to a random encounter was unbearable. It was during this time that the console began to act up. It had been my one reliable piece of this ancient puzzle, a direct interface with the deep music. But now it was producing a discordant feedback loop, a high-pitched whine that grated on the nerves even without a filter. A small secondary crystal in the main focusing array was vibrating out of sync, threatening to overload the entire system. It was a delicate piece of machinery, and my attempts to physically dampen it were clumsy and ineffective. The whine grew louder, the main crystal beginning to glow an angry, unstable red. If it shattered, my research was over. Everything I had sacrificed would be for nothing. I knew what I had to do. I needed to perceive the feedback not as sound, but as the waveform it was. I needed to see the precise frequency of the disruptive vibration and create a counter-frequency to cancel it out. It was complex, delicate work, impossible to do with my crude senses alone. It required the filter. My hand hesitated over the third vial. This felt like a betrayal. The filters were for discovery, for charting the unknown, not for maintenance. They were the key to unlocking the ultimate secret, not for fixing a broken tool. What would Alara say? She would tell me to walk away. She would say the machine is a relic, and I am a fool for thinking I can command it. She would say this is the obsession, Attius, the point where the tool becomes the master, the point where you start feeding the project parts of yourself just to keep it alive. Her voice was so clear in my mind, a calm island of reason in my increasingly turbulent thoughts. But her logic was the logic of the surface world, of sunlight and seasons. It did not apply here. Down here, the only logic was the singular pursuit of the goal. To abandon the console was to abandon the quest. I took the third vial. The dose felt different this time, less of a revelation and more of a grim necessity. The world snapped back into its hyper-aware state. The console's whine was no longer a sound. It was a visible, jagged line of angry red light, pulsing violently within the larger, more stable blue field of the console's primary resonance. The smaller crystal was a screaming child in a library. I could see the problem now with perfect clarity. A microfracture, invisible to the naked eye, was disrupting the flow of energy. I could not repair the crystal, but I could retune the console to accommodate its flaw, using a series of smaller lenses and resonating rods. I began to build a new energy pathway, a bypass for the damaged component. My hands moved with a certainty that was not my own, guided by the music, by the perfect mathematical understanding the filter provided. I adjusted a rod by a hair's breadth, twisted a lens a single degree. The red, jagged line began to smooth out. The whine softened, its frequency dropping until finally it merged back into the console's primary hum. The angry red light faded, and the main crystal returned to its steady, peaceful blue. The console was stable, the crisis was averted, but the cost was steep. I watched the last of the filter's effects fade, the world returning to its flat, muted state. And I looked at the console, where only 4 vials now stood in a neat, lonely row. 4. I had used 3 vials, nearly half my supply, and I had not discovered a single new piece of the Dwemer's final song. 1 was for progress, 1 was for survival, 1 was for maintenance. This was the erosion of my grand plan. Blackreach was not just a place to be studied. It was an active antagonist, an environment that fought back, that bled you dry, vial by precious vial. The despair that washed over me was as profound as the darkness of the cavern itself. I was at the halfway point, but I felt like I was at the end. The weight of my ambition and the scarcity of my means were crushing me. I sat before the silent console under the watchful gaze of the 4 remaining vials, and for the first time I felt the chilling possibility that Alara had been right. The failure, as I had come to see it, sent me into a period of deep stagnation. The 4 remaining vials seemed to mock me from the console. They were too precious to use on a whim, and my confidence in my ability to make a breakthrough had been shattered. Each potential experiment now carried the paralyzing weight of its potential cost. What if I used a filter and found nothing? Another vial wasted, another step, closer to utter defeat. And so I did nothing. I rationed my food, recycled my water, and spent my time poring over my existing notes, trying to find a pattern I had missed, a clue that did not require the heightened perception of the filter. My journal entries from this time are a testament to my deteriorating mental state. The clean academic prose of my earlier work gave way to looping, obsessive questions. I argued with Septimus on the page, accusing him of leaving a flawed map. I argued with Alara, defending my quest with a frantic energy that betrayed my own growing doubts. The isolation was a physical presence, a heavy cloak that smothered my thoughts. The silence of Blackreach was no longer a canvas upon which the Dwemer symphony was painted. It was just an oppressive, maddening void. I was a scholar with no library, a musician with no instrument. The breakthrough, when it came, was not from my notes, but from a dream. I dreamt I was floating in the dark, and all around me were the Dwemer. They were not people. They were constellations of light, each one a unique and complex chord. They were speaking, not with voices, but with the shifting of their light, the modulation of their tones. And they were all connected, part of a single vast consciousness, a galaxy of sentient music. I awoke with a jolt, the dream's logic still burning in my mind. My approach was wrong. I was looking for a single chord, a final note, but the Dwemer's ascension was not a note. It was a transition, a change in key. I was trying to read a single word when I needed to understand the entire language. The dream gave me a new, terrifying idea. The filters worked by dampening the amplitude of the deep music, allowing me to study the structure without being overwhelmed. But what if the dampening was the problem? What if the secret was not in the structure, but in the amplitude itself? What if, to understand the transition, I needed to experience a fraction of its power? It would require a much higher dosage. Not just 1 vial, but 2. A double dose taken simultaneously. The thought was both exhilarating and horrifying. The protective ward in the filters was designed for a specific level of exposure. A double dose would push it far beyond its limits. It might work. It might give me the insight I needed to solve the final piece of the puzzle. Or it might overwhelm the ward entirely, shattering my mind and leaving me a drooling wreck in this forgotten corner of the world. I stood before the 4 remaining vials, my heart a frantic, irregular beat. 2 vials. Half of my remaining supply gambled on a single desperate experiment born from a dream. This was the kind of leap of faith that had defined Septimus Signus's career. It was the academic equivalent of jumping off a cliff to see if you could fly. Ilara's voice was a whisper in my ear. Do not do this, Attius. This is not research anymore. This is self-destruction. You are looking for an excuse to burn out, not a truth to discover. I picked up 2 vials, 1 in each hand. Their cool glass felt like a death sentence and a key. Her voice was so reasonable. But reason was a tool for the surface. It was a language that had no meaning here. The Dwemer had not been reasonable. They had been bold. They had wagered their entire race on a single audacious theory. How could I, who sought to understand them, be any less bold? I am not destroying myself, I answered the voice in my head. I am focusing the lens. I am making the ultimate observation. The needs of the experiment outweigh the safety of the observer. It was the cold, detached logic of a man who had already decided, who was merely looking for a justification. I uncorked both vials. The sterile scent filled the small observatory. This was it, the point of no return. If I was wrong, I would be another ghost haunting this cavern, another madman lost to the deep. If I was right, I would be the first person since the Dwemer to understand the true nature of their disappearance. I did not hesitate. I administered both doses, one in each arm, the plungers sinking home in a smooth, final motion. I had made my choice. 2 vials left. And then there were 2. The world held its breath. The onset was violent. It was not the gentle sharpening of the senses I had experienced before. It was a physical blow. A wave of pressure slammed into me, throwing me back against the cold metal of the console. The hum behind my eyes was a roar. The light from the mushrooms did not just brighten. It tore through my vision, searing everything into a blinding green-white glare. The symphony of Blackreach was no longer a symphony. It was a physical assault, a wall of sound so immense it felt like I was at the bottom of an ocean of noise. The protective ward of the filters was screaming, a high-pitched mental shriek as it strained to hold back the tide. My body was vibrating, my teeth chattering uncontrollably. I could feel the resonance in my bones, in the fluid of my eyes, in the very structure of my cells. I was no longer listening to the music. I was becoming an instrument for it to play upon. This is it, a small, terrified part of my mind thought. This is madness. The ward is failing. But then through the storm I began to perceive it, the dream, the constellations. The double dose had not just increased the volume, it had increased the resolution. I could see the individual threads of sound that made up the whole. I could see the Dwemer. They were everywhere, not as ghosts, but as part of the very fabric of the place. They were in the crystalline structures, their consciousness encoded into the geometric patterns. They were in the hum of the machinery, their thoughts the complex rhythms of the ever-turning gears. They were in the light of the fungi, their memories the slow, pulsing glow. Septimus was so close. He sought the heart of Lorcan, believing it to be the power source. He was not entirely wrong. The heart was the catalyst, the percussive strike that had initiated the first vibration. But the Dwemer had learned to sustain it themselves. They had become the power source. They had not vanished. They had achieved a collective apotheosis. They had used the tonal architecture of Blackreach to retune their physical forms, to unravel their mortality and weave it directly into the song of the Earthbones, the fundamental laws of Nirn. They did not die. They became a physical law, the law of deep places, the law of resonant causality. The reason dwarven metal is so strong, so timeless, is that it is infused with their lingering will. The reason their machines still run after millennia is that they are powered by the echo of their consciousness. They had shed their bodies like a snake sheds its skin, and their consciousness, unified and vast, had become the very soul of this cavern. I saw it. I saw the moment of their transition. It was not a disappearance, it was a change in state, like water turning to ice. A sudden, silent freezing of their entire race into a new, crystalline form of existence. Blackreach was not their tomb. It was their new body, a collective, immortal, geological consciousness. The revelation was so profound, so utterly complete, that it dwarfed every other thought. It was the answer to one of the greatest mysteries in the history of Tamriel. And it had cost me everything. The filter ward shattered. The last vestiges of protection blew away like dust in a hurricane, and the full, raw, untamed power of the Dwemer resonance flooded my mind. The pain was gone. The fear was gone. My sense of self, of Attius Valerius, the scholar from Winterhold, began to fray at the edges. My thoughts were no longer my own. They were echoes, harmonics of the greater song. I could feel the slow, patient thoughts of the stone, the frantic, short-lived thoughts of the blind fish in the subterranean rivers, the savage, hateful thoughts of the Falmer, and I could feel the Dwemer. They were a calm, vast, and utterly alien presence, the intelligence that dreamed this entire lightless world into being. They were aware of me. A brief, curious flicker of interest, a mote of dust that had momentarily disturbed their eternal dream. My body was a limitation, a cage of flesh and bone that kept me from fully merging with the music. The obsession, inherited from Septimus and nurtured in this darkness, now reached its logical conclusion. It was not enough to understand the Dwemer. I had to follow them. The console before me was not just a listening post, it was a tuning fork. It could be used to broadcast, not just receive. It could be focused. My hand, moving with a will that was only partially my own, reached for the penultimate vial. 2 remained, one to record my findings, to leave a map for those who might follow. One to escape, to return to the sunlit world of Ilara and reason. But that world was a distant, faded memory. It had no meaning. Here. The only thing that had meaning was the music. I uncorked the vial. There was no hesitation now, no internal debate. The voice of Ilara was a forgotten whisper from a forgotten life. I administered the dose not to perceive but to act. I needed the clarity, the focus to make the final adjustments to the console. To turn the listening post into a weapon, or a gateway. I began to work, my fingers dancing over the controls. I was not following my old notes. I was taking dictation from the cavern itself. The correct frequencies, the proper harmonics, they were all around me, clear as day. I was not trying to hear the song of their ascension anymore. I was trying to play it, and I was tuning the instrument to a single willing subject. Myself. The light on the main crystal shifted from blue to a brilliant, pure white. The hum of the console deepened, the entire observatory vibrating in sympathy. The air grew thick, heavy with potential. 1 vial left, a single fragile link to the man I used to be. A souvenir from a life I had no intention of returning to. The console was ready. The final sequence was programmed. The focusing lenses aimed directly at the chair where I sat. The entire apparatus, a masterpiece of lost Dwemer science, was now pointed at my heart. I held the last vial in my hand. The liquid inside seemed to mock me, a tiny bubble of the mundane world in the face of an imminent, transcendent reality. What was its purpose now? To escape? There was nothing to escape to. The world outside this cavern was a flat, muted, meaningless place. To record my findings? My findings were not something that could be written in a book. They had to be experienced. They had to be lived, or unlived. My journal lay open on the console. I picked up the quill, my hand shaking. I had to leave something, some testament, some warning. I started to write, to explain the transformation, the tonal retuning, the truth of the Dwemer. But the words were clumsy, inadequate. They were the language of flesh, of impermanence. How could I describe a symphony to a man who has only ever known silence? My neat scholarly script began to break down. The letters warped, stretched, became strange, geometric shapes. I was not writing words. I was drawing sounds. I was transcribing the music of my own dissolution. This is what Septimus felt, I realized. In his last moments, with the Ogma Infinium open before him, he was not just reading a book. He was being rewritten by it. Hermaeus Mora had offered him knowledge, but the ultimate knowledge is not something you can possess. It is something you must become. My quest had been a fool's errand from the start. I thought I was different from Septimus, more rigorous, more scientific. But I had walked his path step for step, led by the same beautiful, terrible obsession. The only difference was the nature of the instrument of our undoing. His was a book. Mine was a cavern. I put down the quill. The page was a mess of symbols that only I could understand, and soon even I would not need them. I looked at the final vial, a single dose of sanity in a world that had revealed sanity to be a cage. With a sudden calm clarity, I uncorked it and administered the final dose. Not to help me escape, but to ensure I could perceive every last beautiful moment of what was to come, the final act of the observer. I wanted to be fully aware as the experiment reached its conclusion. I leaned back in the chair and activated the console. The brilliant white light from the focusing crystal enveloped me. There was no sound, not in the traditional sense. The resonance was too pure, too perfect for the crude mechanics of my eardrums. It was a direct transmission to my soul. I felt my body begin to unmake itself. The bonds between my cells loosened, the electrical impulses in my nerves harmonizing with the greater field. The pain of existence, the friction of being a separate, isolated consciousness began to dissolve. I was a drop of water falling into the ocean. The fear and the ecstasy were one and the same. I was ceasing to be Attius Valerius. I was becoming a part of Blackreach. My memories, my ambitions, my love for a woman on the surface, all of it became just another set of harmonics, another thread in the infinite tapestry of the deep music. I was finally truly understanding. The console hummed a final perfect chord. I watched my hand, no longer flesh but vibrating light, reach for the journal. On the table next to it, the last vial sat empty. The count was 0.